Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about the concept of an emergency fighter. Like the name implies, an emergency fighter is literally a fighter designed for emergency circumstances, and that circumstance typically revolves around either a sheer lack of resources or a sheer lack of more advanced or well-made fighters. Examples of such aircraft can be found all over the world, and a great number of them have their origins in the Second World War, which does make a lot of sense. In World War I, aviation wasn't terribly advanced, and emergency fighters wouldn't be completely necessary. But with the explosion of air power in the years after, the next major global conflict would heavily involve air power and defending against air power, and if a country were on the back foot, or under immediate threat of destruction, then they would be making these emergency fighters. The clearest example of such aircraft came from Germany at the end of the Second World War, since they literally had a program called the Emergency Fighter Program that was designed to just pump out new aircraft to defend the homeland. From this program, a plethora of bizarre and also pretty technologically advanced designs would be born. Most of them never advanced past the drawing board due to various logistical issues, time, resources, cost, etc. But some of them were actually built, in designs like the HE-162, the BA-349, the BV-40, and at the very least the HE-162 was a decent enough idea that didn't have enough time to develop. But by and large, Germany's emergency fighters were these conceptually powerful and somewhat advanced jet and rocket aircraft designed and intended to surpass and take out the very best Allied aircraft. But over on the other side of the emergency aircraft coin, we have aircraft that were basically guaranteed to be worse than what the enemy had. Aircraft where excellent performance wasn't the major goal, but rather the major goal was ease of production and use. It's in this vein that you have something like the Bell XP-77. Now, technically the XP-77 wasn't classified as an emergency fighter, but rather as a lightweight interceptor, but for all intents and purposes, it was an emergency fighter. I made a short video on it quite a while ago, but for the Cliff Notes version, it was designed to be a small, lightweight fighter that used non-strategic materials as much as possible. This meant that it was largely made of wood with no armor, and it used a very small and underpowered engine that had just 500 horsepower. While it never advanced past the prototype phase, should the course of the war had gone drastically different, and America went on the defensive and maybe even somehow had to defend its homeland, fighters like the XP-77 would have been created. It would be something that was quick and easy to make that could provide at least some kind of token defense. The best ability for these kind of aircraft was their availability, their sheer numbers, and their ease of production. Now, while the prospect of America needing something like the XP-77 to defend the homeland, that was dubious at best due to their geographic location, for our subject for today, their geographic location made such a fighter very much more viable, and if things had gone slightly differently, it's a plane that may have ended up becoming a relatively prominent one in the Royal Air Force. This is Britain's emergency Spitfire. This is the Miles M20. Its story begins around the start of World War II, either just before or just after. The prologue of its story is quite short and very simple. In a private venture from Miles Aircraft, then mostly known for civilian and training aircraft, designed by Walter G. Capley, they attempted to make a cheap, easy-to-produce fighter that would largely use the parts of other Miles designs, namely in the Miles Master, a trainer. The initial design, known as the M21, essentially looked like a modified Miles Master, keeping its inverted gull wings and inline liquid-cooled engine, but likely using a slightly stronger inline liquid-cooled engine, and also modifying the canopy and tail to be more aerodynamic. Unfortunately for Miles, though, in the early stages of the war, with Britain not really having anything to do, or alternatively, if the design was presented before the war started, either way there was no real purpose for this cheap and openly low-performance fighter, and after being presented to Sir Kingsley Wood, the design was not approved and Miles largely went back to training aircraft. But as the war progressed, or began, and Western Europe became directly involved after the German invasion of France, with Britain being pushed off the mainland and Germany sitting just over the channel, the prospect of intense German bombing and a German invasion of Britain became incredibly probable. In the likelihood of a mass German offensive, and the likelihood of Germany targeting British aircraft production facilities, it would certainly behoove them to have some kind of backup plan. In the case that Germany took out vital Spitfire and Hurricane factories, Britain needed something that they could make quickly and easily, and for this, Miles would meet with the British Air Ministry in July 1940 and came to an agreement on a contract for one prototype, to be delivered in under 3 months, and it would fall under the new specification F-1940. Performance-wise, this new design was required to reach a top speed of at least 350 miles an hour at 21,000 feet, with a service ceiling of 32,000 feet. Additionally, not necessarily part of the specification, but more so just expected and also allegedly agreed upon in their initial meeting, the design would be an all-wood construction with fixed landing gear and no hydraulics. This trifecta would help save vital resources, like lightweight metal alloys, it would save time and space on the frame, and it would save the limited hydraulics for more advanced and more important aircraft. Miles would end up outdoing the 3-month time frame by having the initial prototype done in just 2 months, and on September 15, 1940, the Miles M20-2, simplified to just the M20, would take to the air for the first time. Measuring in at 9.17 meters long, 10.54 meters wide, and 3.81 meters tall, the diminutive M20 attempted to make up for its small stature and lack of armor with its simplicity and surprising offensive capabilities. Powering the plane would be a Rolls-Royce Merlin with 1,260 horsepower. To help make production faster and easier, the engine and its cooling system were contained in a so-called power egg, an arrangement typically seen on larger bombers that condensed all of the necessary engine components into a singular unit. Originally intended to help make engine repair and replacement easier on bombers, here on the M20, the idea was probably mostly about production simplicity and helping keep the rest of the frame empty to be used for weaponry and fuel. Moving back to the wings, the M20 would have a sneaky potential armament, upwards of 12 .303 caliber machine guns. While the .303 caliber wasn't really a great caliber for combat aircraft at this point, the fact that there would be 12 of them more than made up for that. Plus, the .303 would be a widely available round, since it was used by the Lee Enfield rifle and the Bren machine gun. While 12 guns would be the maximum, the initial prototype only had 8, likely in an effort to help reduce weight and improve performance. But still, for such a small and thin-looking aircraft, 8 guns was pretty impressive, and it was able to do this because of its fixed landing gear, Since the gear didn't retract into the wings, there was more room in the wings for guns and ammo, and in each of the wings there would be 4 guns. For the cockpit, despite the design's intended simplicity, it had a rather modern and kind of more advanced bubble-style canopy that would increase pilot vision. It was in the canopy and the cockpit that the only significant armor of any kind would be located, with the canopy being made of bulletproof glass, and the cockpit itself having a couple millimeters of armor plating. Moving back to the tail, the horizontal and vertical surfaces were pretty basic, and for some reason that I couldn't actually find an explanation for, the end of the tail had this small little extension or nub. Since Miles wasn't supposed to use hydraulics in their design to control the control surfaces, they would instead use pneumatics. And lastly to mention, since there was a good deal of free space in the fuselage and the wings, the fuel capacity was surprisingly high at 154 gallons, giving it a maximum range of 870 miles. As a whole, factoring in the fuel, the guns, and the ammo, the maximum takeoff weight of the M20 was still relatively light, at 7,758 pounds. In its initial flight testing, despite its incredibly short development of just a couple months, the M20 actually showed itself to be pretty solid, controlling relatively well, and having a solid enough top speed, maxing out at 350 miles an hour at 20,600 feet. This top speed placed it right in between the Spitfire and the Hurricane, being a little bit faster than the Hurricane and slower than the Spitfire. However, the M20 was also noted to be less maneuverable than both of them, and it had a longer takeoff run than both as well. Still, for a fighter that was to be made for pennies on the dollar, so to speak, it held a surprising amount of promise, which warranted that it continue testing through the rest of the year and into 1941. That testing, though, wouldn't be terribly fruitful for 2 specific reasons. The first reason is that in early 1941, the M20 prototype crashed and was damaged. Not destroyed, but damaged. During a test flight on the landing, the brakes failed and caused the plane to skid off the end of the runway and into a watery ditch. The plane could have been repaired, but the second reason kind of made that pointless. By early 1941, the need for this emergency Spitfire had faded. The immediate threat of a German invasion of Britain was gone, and Britain had managed to space out, hide, and solidify their production lines. And with them not really suffering from production issues for the Spitfire, there wasn't a need for this blatantly inferior fighter. So once the prototype crashed, that was basically the end of it, and sometime later it would be scrapped. Thus, in its initial intended role, the M20 was dead. But since the design still existed and performed decently enough for what it was decided to shift it over to the Royal Navy as a prospective limited-use expendable fighter, since it was light, easy to make, and used abundant resources. This made it optimal to use as a fighter that would be launched from small, non-carrier ships. Something like the M20 would be catapulted from smaller vessels to help defend against incoming enemy fighters, and once the mission was completed, as they couldn't land back on the non-carrier aircraft, the pilot would simply just bail out, and the plane would be lost to the sea. With this new role, a new specification, N141, would be created in mid-1941, and a second prototype M20 would be constructed. This one a little bit different, in that it had an arrestor hook, in case they decided to use it on carriers. Despite also performing relatively well for what it was, this new role M20 would amount to basically nothing, after it was decided to use older model Hurricanes for this disposable plane role, and testing of the second M20 would not continue past 1942, and it too would be scrapped. Ultimately, for the M20, its eventual failure really didn't have much to do with its overall performance. It wasn't an amazing aircraft or anything like that, but for what it was and how little time it took to produce and develop it, in the right situation and in the right country, the M20 could have been a legitimate game changer and country saver. Imagine if in the invasion of Poland they had a whole bunch of M20s. Or maybe in the invasion of France. At the very least, it would have helped them put up a more formidable defense and give the Germans a lot more trouble, and make them spend more time and resources. But instead, it exists today as this neat little what-if backup emergency Spitfire. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. At the time of writing this, the Baltimore Antique Arms Show is in a couple days, and I'm very excited for it. I'm hoping to find a Miles 36, the rifle that the French used, but really half the fun of these kind of shows is looking around at all the neat things that you really can't afford. Like you see something, you're like, oh wow, I'll never own that, but I can look at it, and it's pretty neat. Maybe I can touch it. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.